talking with Sergeant Greg Amundson with Missoula Police Department. I understand as we get closer and closer to school time, Greg, that you folks are going to be emphasizing pedestrian crossing and safety therein, right?
That's correct. Yeah, we normally start in the summer and then in through the fall. Just with the influx of the college students, we tend to have a lot more pedestrians, a lot more walking in town.
Okay, what kind of things do we need to look out for both the drivers and pedestrians?
Well, there's two things that pedestrian can do. The pedestrian can make sure that they always cross in a crosswalk, which would be at the end of a street, where there's an intersection. Whether there's a marked crosswalk or not, there's an implied crosswalk there. And then the second thing pedestrians need to remember is that they need to make sure it's safe for them to step out before they do. You do have right-of-way, but you do have to yield to cars that are close enough that they would be an immediate hazard if you were to step out.
Okay, how about drivers? What can we do to stay safe?
Well, drivers should just make sure that they're kind of always scanning, making sure they're looking ahead to make sure that there's not any pedestrians that might be stepping out. And one of the biggest conflict areas that we have is drivers that are making a right, say on a red light where you can take your free ride after you stopped, or turning right from a stop sign. Make sure you glance to your right again before you go, because oftentimes a pedestrian will begin to cross while you're waiting to pull out into traffic, and most people only look left when they're waiting to do that. So that's kind of a conflict area that we'd like people to avoid.
Now, Greg, what about bicyclists using pedestrian lanes?
Bicyclists, by state law, are allowed to ride on the sidewalk. They're also allowed to ride through crosswalks, but they have all of those same burdens placed on them when they do that are placed on pedestrians. So our interpretation of that here in the city is that if they come off a sidewalk into a crosswalk, they have to do that at the same pace that a pedestrian would come out into the street. You can't ride your bike down the sidewalk at 15 miles an hour and then just shoot out into traffic at 15 miles an hour. You do have to slow down, and if vehicles are close enough to be an immediate hazard, you have to stop and wait for them.
Sure.
Come off at what would be the comparable pace to a pedestrian.
Okay. Now, we had on our talk show this morning, we had some interesting questions about the bike lanes and vehicles that need to turn right at an upcoming intersection. At what point does the bike lane end and the opportunity for them to turn right begin?
It would depend on where you're at in town, because sometimes the bike lanes do end before you get to intersections. But let's take, for example, Spruce and Ryman downtown. That bicycle lane runs all the way to the intersection, and there is no point where the bike lane actually ends and the vehicle does not have to yield. When a vehicle wants to turn right, say they're traveling eastbound on Spruce and they want to turn right to go southbound on Ryman, the vehicle is required at all times to yield to the bicycle that is traveling in that bike lane, because the bike has its own designated lane.
Okay. But where the bike lane does end, then the two have to kind of share the road?
Correct, but the bike lane does not end at the intersection. They just don't paint it in the intersection, I think, because of confusion. But there are places in town where, for a certain number of blocks, there's a bike lane, and then it goes down to where it's just kind of a shared road situation.
Okay, so
still the car needs to, if the car passes a bicycle and, 20 feet later they want to turn right, they need to yield to that bicycle and not turn in front of them.